Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. This week we'll be continuing our reading of Erica Berman's Deconstructing Developmental Psychology, specifically chapter 5. So we'll be looking at discourses of the child, deconstructing the globalized child, early intervention, and resiliency. So just a quick note about practicum information for you. There was an important notice that went out, so effective September 2019. Students must have completed 276 and 277, which are the practicums, in order to enroll in 300 and 400 level courses. So submission of practicum documents ensure the opportunity to register for a practicum course. It does not guarantee students' placement in practicum, and the deadline for submission is October 24th. Students will be placed in a practicum site within the Capilano University boundaries, so areas such as the North Shore, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Corridor, Burnaby, and Vancouver, and all locations are accessible by public transit. So to do this week for Monday, read chapter 5 of Erica Berman's text and prepare two or three questions for the virtual collaboratory. By Friday at 11:55 p.m., post one word and definition to the word bank forum or add to others' definitions. And this week by Sunday at 11:55 p.m., you can post your week 5 notes and watch the Changing Education Paradigms video posted on Moodle, and that's by Ken Robinson. And of course, participate in your group's 1-hour virtual collaboratory and add to your collaborative Google Doc. So this week you won't be required to respond to other posts in the weekly notes forum, as I think that this week's chapter is quite dense and requires a lot of time and thought. So I'm really encouraging you to spend time with the reading this week and really try to get a sense of what Berman is asking us to consider and think about this with a critical lens. So while you're not required to respond to your peers this week, you can, of course, if you want to. And also I think it's great to read other people's posts just to get some ideas from your peers and see what thoughts are emerging across the group. So thinking back to last week and the critical look at some of the parenting advice that we engaged with, I just took a few quotes from some of you to further discuss some of these discourses that are kind of emerging in parenting advice. So Veronica looked at an article on bedtime stories and childhood literacy, and she writes that the practice of parents reading stories to their children at bedtime refers to Western societies as an experience to support bonding and to foster early literacy. However, it's also suggested that there is not a singular pathway to become literate. There are many different paths to literacy. So therefore, Veronica argues, these practices in childhood are partial and based on one group's particular views and position. So this is taking a critical look at childhood literacies and considering that there may not only be one story in childhood literacy. So Adriana looked at an article on disciplining your toddler, and she writes, in this article, it's quite obvious that the cultural representation is of the white upper middle class families. This article goes into depth about the ages and stages at the end, as we know, has a great general idea of where and what a child can and could do at a certain age. However, every child is different and may be quicker on this scale or slightly slower. So this is going back into that narrative of parenting advice that tend to give quick tips that stem from a developmental lens of who a child at this age is and who they can become. And in this way, it defines how a parent ought to respond according to this particular Western way of knowing children. Yet, as Adriana states here, every child is different, and this developmental baseline that many parenting tips reinforce are an inscription into this normative view. And this is the kind of critical lens that we need to look at when we're considering parenting advice and some of the discourses and technologies that are available to us as early childhood educators. So last week we watched a clip of Sarah Ahmed speaking about feminist theory and the importance of questioning universalities or generalized assumptions about what it means to be human. So this is another example of a critical lens. Thinking critically requires that we question and think deeply about the things we assume to be given. questioning normalcy as a baseline in all of its dimension, and to consider why it came to be this way and what it does. So this is very much the lens that Erica Berman is taking up in our textbook. She's critically unpacking and deconstructing taken for granted assumptions and notions of child development, mapping the histories which inform its presence, and discussing how it functions as an oppressive tool via governmentality. So she discusses how these theories of child development generate particular managerial practices in early childhood education that create social hierarchies which privilege people in certain positions. So thinking critically in this way often involves tracing and unpacking the roots of assumed truths and reading texts or taken for granted texts in multiple ways, looking for multiple angles, and considering the social and political contextual underpinnings of a text. So some questions to frame this week. There are only two because I want you to really focus on a rich analysis and a rich unpacking of some of these questions. So the first one is actually a question that's brought back from last week because I think it's a crucial theme throughout the text and requires sustained attention. So within this chapter, what are some examples of how societal and structural problems manifest themselves in individual bodies? The second question is, what does Berman mean when she writes that resiliency colonizes our hopes for social justice? That's on page 108. So thinking back to this first question about how structural and social problems manifest themselves in individual bodies, this is encouraging you to take a critical lens in your work and in your reading. So in your Pechakucha and your written paper, think critically and show an attention to the social and structural contexts which create a particular dominant image of childhood. So this will be central in your work. It's necessary to look beyond the surface of what we assume is normal to investigate where our ideas about normalcy come from, how normalcy is a social construction that benefits particular people and prescribes hidden rules about what it means to be a child, a parent, an educator, hidden rules that become invisible to those who benefit from them. So you'll need to demonstrate critical thought by questioning assumptions about childhood and development in your assignments. And your weekly notes, I think, is a good opportunity to start trying out some of this kind of work. So throughout this book, Erica Berman discusses colonialism. She discusses the colonial structures of childhood. So just to give you a bit of an introduction into this concept, settler colonialism is not something that ended after European settlers stole the land of Turtle Island's indigenous peoples and enforced Euro-colonial rule by displacing the original peoples and monopolizing on their land. This is not something that ended as a historical part of Canada. Rather, settler colonialism is an ongoing set of rationalities that govern and appropriate the ways in which Canada operates as a state through societal structures, institutions, and in our minds. Settler colonialism works to attain a management of bodies and subsequently of land. So settler colonialism creates particular values within societies that serve the needs of the dominant group, individualism, accumulation, and productivity, to further fuel the colonial agenda of conquest and economic expansion. These values create unequal hierarchies within society and create systems which surveil people in order to ensure its progress. So with this said, colonialism is different from settler colonialism in that with colonialism, the settlers did not stay and settle on another's land, but rather this dominant group exploits the land and resources and bodies from afar, so often through trade, debt, education, etc. Globalization could be an example of an expansion of the Euro-colonial project and its effects. So the dominant image of the Euro-colonial child is being increasingly globalized. And this is sort of an ongoing manifestation of colonization, where children that do not reflect this ideal image of the innocent, happy, developing child that's associated with Western notions of childhood are considered as in need, vulnerable, or even dangerous. So Erica Berman in this week's chapter gives examples of the Euro-Western narrative that seeks to protect children from child labor or from stolen childhoods. And these racialized and ethnocentric images of children uphold the ideal image of the Euro-Western child as the basis of all children, and prevents us from considering the conditions and meanings of children's participation within local economies. So it ignores the socio-political constellations that create conditions that child labor is in response to. And moreover, it veils the reality that child labor might also be seen as a structural feature of capitalist societies where citizen rights are based upon an individual's ability to produce and generate income. So moreover, globalization and neoliberal market needs have created a popular and desirable image of the productive child that is not only developmentally sound, but increasingly flexible, creative, and adaptive. So this child possesses skills and mentalities that are deemed necessary to be productive contributors in the fast-paced and competitive global market of the 21st century. Yet when we're thinking about these new desired skills of children, what's not changed is the strong colonial value that links children's abilities as an instrument for economic gain, accumulation, and expansion. So individualism and competition is intensified in this time of advanced capitalism and neocolonialism. So as you'll see in Ken Robinson's video this week, these rationalities place social responsibility for problems inside the bodies of people, rather than the contextual conditions which create them. So the rapid expansion of children's pharmaceutical drugs is an example of this, and an increasing diagnoses of ADHD is another example that's linked to this rapid expansion. So another example in this chapter that Berman describes is resiliency discourses, or the individual ability to bounce back from adversity. So Berman is shifting the question about this from what characteristics does a child need to bounce back to what is it that this child is bouncing back from? What conditions is this child in response to? So Berman quotes Henderson and Denny when she writes, "What accentuates the need to be resilient in the first place?" So here Berman is bringing us to think beyond the individual, to consider the contextual and political conditions that create particular problems. So she's troubling the idea of the one child at a time narrative, which locates both problems and solutions inside an individual body, separate from the context which positions people to inherit these problems. So an individual solution is not the only thing that needs to change, because individuals will continue to bump up against the same oppressive systems that position them in these marginalized spaces in the first place.